Hey, so this is the Drunkalogs, a podcast about addiction and recovery in which each guest shares their version of how it was, what happened, and how it is now, and then endures a half-hour Q&A at the hands of your host, Nick Morton. My next guest is a bit of Hollywood royalty, the son of an international movie star and Academy Award winner for Best Actor. But I really knew him as part of my parents' crowd of waspy New Yorkers spending their summers out on Long Island, where he was always, in my mind, the life of the party. And it was a thrill to me when soon after I got sober, I found out that he was sober too, because I had seen so few men from that world get sober, and even fewer speak about it openly. He had a career in finance before becoming an entrepreneur, and then spent 20 years at Sothebys, where he eventually rose to the position of Chairman of the Americas. He has a long record of supporting great causes, and currently chairs the Partnership to End Addiction. Won't you please welcome Jamie Niven. So Jamie Niven, welcome. How was it? Where did you grow up? Let's start at the beginning.
You want to start at the beginning? Okay, I grew up in Pacific Palisades, California. And I lived there for 12, 13 years. And then my father moved to Switzerland, which made me move to Switzerland.
Now, just to give some context, your father was David Niven, the
Correct.
famous actor of film and television.
Correct, and writer.
Right. Yes, he wrote this amazing memoir.
Several great books.
A balloon, yeah.
One's called The Moon's a Balloon, and the other was called Bring on the Empty Horses.
Right, I haven't read that one, but The Moon is a
Bring
Balloon.
on the Empty Horses is about Hollywood in the 30s and 40s, and The Moon's a Balloon is autobiographical up to sort of when he won the Academy Award. So
right, wow.
1958, 59 kind of thing.
And so was it like a Hollywood childhood up until you guys moved to Switzerland?
Well, it was different because you had Hollywood kids that you associated with, mostly organized by nannies, all British, of course.
Right.
And then I went to a Catholic school called Corpus Christi in Pacific Palisades, which still exists.
Right.
And so I had friends from there. So I really had two different lives.
Right. Right.
And that was interesting. It sure contrasted a lot to arriving in Switzerland at age 13 and sitting on an Alp with no friends and by yourself. That was kind of bad.
And
but anyway,
I did the tiniest bit of Googling this morning, and I saw your mom died when you were very young. My
mother died when I was 6 months old.
Oh, I didn't realize it was that young.
Yeah.
Wow, my math is terrible. Somehow I read that as 6 years old.
They were playing a game called Sardines, and in Power's house across the street, Tyrone Power.
Right.
For those of you who are my age will know who he was. Anyone younger will not. And she made a mistake and opened a closet door. She thought it was the back stairs, and she fell down, and she never recovered.
Wow, that's brutal.
So it was a bit of that was tough. Obviously for my father, it was very tough because now he's got two boys, one age 2.5, the other just born.
Right. And
he had to figure out how to bring them up, which was hard because my father's career was obviously stopped during the war because my father was a British Army officer, and he went back to fight in 1939, and he didn't really work until 1945.
And when were you born?
1945.
Right.
So he was demobilized at the end of the war, and then went back to Pacific Palisades, where he made a movie called A Matter of Life and Death, which was a really quite extraordinary avant-garde film directed by Michael Powell. So it was it was good for him, but not so good for us.
Right. Sure.
Oh, anyway, we moved to Switzerland, and I went to, at that point in time, I was in school in St. Paul's School in Concord, New Hampshire, which was a very hoity-toity boys' school in those days. And some friends of my father's thought it was a really great idea that my brother and I should go there. And I went in the 7th and 8th grade,
wow.
Which was difficult because I spoke English like bitchin' for sure. It's good to see you. And all those people there were, Jesus, it's nice to see you. What's it like living in Hollywood? Oh, must be marvelous out there. So it was really not a happy marriage, any stretch of the imagination.
And so, also, had you moved to Switzerland and then went from Switzerland to St. Paul's?
I hadn't moved to Switzerland yet.
Right.
It was St. Paul's.
Right.
And then moved to Switzerland.
Right.
And then I went to school in Lausanne, Switzerland.
So you didn't stay at St. Paul's after your...
No,
interesting.
Gone. After it was called the first and second form. It was 7th and 8th grade. Gone. Adios, muchachos. And I went to school in Switzerland, and my father had this idea that I should go to Trinity College, Cambridge.
Right.
My mother's family had all gone there many generations, and so the goal was to have enough A levels, which is the exams you have to take to be able to take the entrance exam, and that was the idea. He thought I needed 3. I only needed 2, so I went to London for a year. Lived in South Audley Street, had a car, cash, and it was the time of the world was changing, and the Beatles and Mary Quant dresses, and it was just a fantastic place to be.
Wow.
By then, I was heavily into alcohol.
Right.
And then
when you were growing up, was it like a drinky family? I mean, was like cocktail sort of culture? And
not at all. No, but he did drink. But
right.
As it turned out, my stepmother drank all the time, but I didn't know that when I was young.
Interesting.
Vodka and her were very close companions. Anyway, when you go to school in Switzerland when you're 13, 14 years old, you drink because the bars are all open and who cares?
Right.
But anyway, from London, I applied just because I wanted to see if I could get into UCLA. I kind of liked growing up in California, and I thought, what a good idea. I'll just apply there to see what happens. I mean, I didn't ask anyone's opinion on that. And I did.
Right.
I thought I'd get in easily. I mean, I played soccer. I was a California kid. I was literally an Angelino by about 4 days. I mean,
right.
So what the fuck? And, well, I got turned down, which was really surprising to me. But this is the part that never makes any sense, okay? Just as, I don't know, I applied to Harvard. I remember I wrote a letter to Harvard University, Boston, Massachusetts, and I got an entrance form to fill in from Harvard College, Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I applied there too. About 4 days after I got turned down at UCLA, I was accepted to Harvard. You go figure. Really go figure, right?
Right, yeah. Awesome. Makes zero sense.
It happened. Anyway, I called the guy at Trinity College, Cambridge. I told him what had happened. And he said, you can't come here because if you have a bad day taking your entrance exam, I can't take you. And you can't abandon Harvard, and that is too much of a risk.
Right.
I was 18. Okay.
Right, sure.
I'm not having this conversation with the old man. I'm having it with the guy from Cambridge. So I said to the guy from Cambridge, I said, that's very interesting. Thank you, sir. Where did you do your undergraduate work? He said, Trinity College, Cambridge. I said, fantastic. Wow. Where did you do your graduate work? He said, Harvard. I wish you well, Mr. Niven. That's how I went to Harvard.
Right.
Literally. My father didn't want to pay. We had a terrible fight. Oh, my God. Didn't talk to me for, I had to accept without having any money. I mean, the whole thing was a disaster, but it worked out. And I went,
were you guys close growing up, you and your dad?
No, not at all.
Really? Right.
No, not good in that department.
Right.
I finally figured it out after all these years. The word narcissism comes to play. And you can't expect these people to be very good at what they do unless they are narcissistic.
Right.
And the reason why they like each other is because they're all narcissistic.
Right.
And you're not, right? So anyway, bottom line, I went to Harvard and graduated and then went to work for Lehman Brothers in Wall Street. And so I ended up on the East Coast and got married. And the girls were born very early on. And so I stayed in the East Coast of America.
I mean, it was interesting to me in my Googling that both you and your brother had real professional careers. Like, I mean, you know, it's not the typical Hollywood story where, you know, somehow you guys end out with this like real work ethic.
David stayed in the business.
He stayed in the business, but I mean, and I don't know anything about him, but like just on this Wikipedia page, it's like he was an exact. I mean, he sort of was in the grind. It looked like
he was. He worked for William Morris Agency, like everyone does in the beginning,
right.
And then he worked for Paramount. He worked for Columbia,
right.
And then he became an independent film producer. A lot of things with Jack Haley Jr., who was a great family friend,
right.
And a guy called Frank Yablans, who was head of MGM. And David chose to be in that world.
Did it? I mean, obviously, investment banking's a lot different than Hollywood.
Yeah.
Did that feel like an opportunity to sort of chart your own path, or a rebellion against, or just kind of like?
Not at all. None of the above.
Right.
I applied for a job at CBS and interviewed with Mr. Paley. And he offered me a job at $5,000 a year.
Right.
And went to Lehman Brothers, and they interviewed me there with Mr. Thomas, who was the managing partner, and he offered me $7,500 a year.
There you go.
I just got married. Right. I had about $4 in the bank.
Right.
I chose the guy that paid me the more money.
Sure.
Look, kidding you not. It would have been so much an easier decision to go and work for CBS and work in features, which is what he wanted me to do.
Right.
And 4 years later, I go back and see Paley, and he offers me another job.
Right.
And I don't take it.
Right.
And I get involved with some guy who was investing in deals, and that's how I got sort of away from the investment banking part.
Right. How long did you stay? So you stayed at Lehman for 4 years?
5 years.
Right.
But eventually, you know, I got involved in the spaghetti sauce business, and that was a tremendously successful venture. I remember I was giving a speech in Singapore because my great grandfather started a company there in 1828, and it's still going.
What's that?
It's called Bousted, after his name. I had no idea about this guy at all, by the way. I didn't know he existed. This is actually on my father's side. He didn't either, by the way.
Right.
But it's true. And I was invited to come out and speak at the 180th anniversary of Bousted and Company. 850 Singapore businessmen and women, and most importantly, the head man.
Right.
Who I thought was fascinating. And anyway, so I got to speak. And I tried to talk to this audience about whether my great-great-grandfather would have approved of my father's career and then mine.
Right.
Because they would have all liked my father's career, and mine was a little dodgy. When I said spaghetti sauce, they all laughed. I said, but you'll have to remember, and I'm looking right at the first minister, I said, the most expensive ingredient in a jar of spaghetti sauce is the jar. All these people start to laugh because they're thinking, oh, that's good business. You know,
right.
So I got involved with the oil business after the spaghetti sauce company, and about 25 years ago, I was offered a job to become active at Sothebys, the auction house. So I did that, and I eventually.
And how does what's your drinking like during all these?
Big time.
Right. But you're also operating in a world where that kind of behavior is acceptable for the most part.
You find yourself, as you know, surrounded by people that drink.
Yeah. You're
not hanging around a lot of teetotalers.
Yeah.
At that point. And it caused the end of my marriage, which was sad because we'd been married for almost 30 years.
Right.
But anyway, it was not good. And anyway, I eventually became chairman of Sothebys, the Americas.
Right.
I did a lot of auctions, I did a ton of charity auctions, and was responsible for bringing in lots of business. And I enjoyed that.
How did you transition from this sort of entrepreneurial thing into fine art?
Oil in the ground to oil on the wall. Fantastic change. No question about it. I love the oil business, but we sold the company. Right. And you know what? I'm not sure which one I enjoyed more, oil or spaghetti sauce. But eventually went to work for Sothebys, and I stayed there. And I stayed there until a change of management took place in 2015, and I left.
Right. Wow. That's a good long run.
But I had a lot of near misses, a lot of things that went wrong because of drinking.
How long have you been sober now?
10 years.
10 years. So you
April
got sober while you were at Sotheby's?
Yes.
Right.
It was August the 13th. It was a Friday when I stopped drinking. Yes, I was at Sotheby's, very much so. But, there were a lot of silly things that I did. There were, these bad boo-boos, and the last straw was being rude to a client, of Sotheby's. And that caused, me to have a real talk to myself and to some friends. And particularly the CEO of the company, who was very concerned about it, obviously.
Right.
But the bottom line was, you have to do something about it. You have to. If you do something about it, all the criticism that's going on about you is going to go away. because no one's going to criticize you if you're trying to stop drinking.
Yeah.
But you got to go into you got to be real about this. You just can't say, hey, I'm out.
Yeah.
So I did. I got a shrink, and from a dry out place in Connecticut. I didn't want to go to rehab. I was determined not to do that. So I hired this woman who I've been with now for 10 years, who was my sort of shrink. Mm-hmm. She was my my advisor in all this, my sponsor, actually.
Right.
In a way, as I did it. And I went to meetings like crazy, and I eventually, convinced myself that it was bigger than me. Mm-hmm. And that's 10 years ago.
I mean, it's great to hear that story. And I mean, I grew up in obviously a lot of the same world that you were a part of. Yeah. Sort of that very privileged East Coast entitled country club. Southampton world. Yeah. And, I mean, when I was growing up there, like, it was never something where I was so embarrassed, really. For me, like, one of the big challenges was just being embarrassed to admit that I had a problem. Yeah. That the idea that I had, that somehow it was a failure on my part to not be able to manage this thing myself. And there were so few people in my generation, let alone your generation, who were there to kind of lead the way and say, you know what, this thing's a bear, and like, it kills a lot of us, and it ruins a lot of people's lives, and there's a way out of it. Like, there's a way to get help. And because what I saw growing up was the richest, most popular, most dynamic people in the community were the biggest drinkers. Yeah. And they were celebrated so heavily. Yeah. For all of their, outsized, outlandish behavior. And, that became the thing that, we were encouraged to emulate. And, I remember when I got sober, and I'm 9.5 years sober, so I'm a little bit behind you, and posting on Facebook that, whatever, celebrating a year or 2 years, whatever it was. And you chimed in that you were sober too. And it was, it's just something like I hadn't seen a lot, growing up. And I wonder, have you found of the people of your generation, have you found that there are other people like you? I mean, obviously there are, but was that like a hard shift to make? I mean,
I was sort of pretty much down the bottom of the barrel there. I needed to do something. I have this friend of mine who has been sober a long time, and he's from the Mid-Island, and he went to Notre Dame, and he was a long bond trader, right, at Merrill Lynch, and he was a drinky boy, big time,
right.
And he had a really good friend of his told him, you could do anything you want in your life, but if you drink, you're going to die. You drink the way you're doing now, you're going to die.
Right.
And I had called him when I realized I needed some advice what to do. And he came over. He lived very near me in Southampton. And I played a lot of golf with this guy. And he came over to the house and he said, I got a funny feeling, partner, today we're not talking about golf. I said, we're not. So I explained what had happened to me being rude to the client. And I explained that I needed to do something. And he said, it's really simple. Here's what you're going to do. You're going to stop drinking and you're going to go to meetings. That's all you got to do. Really? That's all you got to do. I will talk to you every day. I will either text you, email you, or talk to you every day for the next 90 days. But that's what you got to do. And let me tell you a couple of things. When you get up in the morning and you look at yourself in the mirror, there's a guy who's going to be standing behind you. He's a lot better looking than you. He's a lot funnier than you. He's better dressed than you. And he's going to want you to have a drink today.
Right.
He's called Mr. Alcohol. And what you're going to say to Mr. Alcohol is, not today. Don't fucking worry about tomorrow. Just today, Mr. Alcohol, you're out. He said, and then something else you should know. When you go out at night, you're the funniest guy in the room. Everyone loves you. My wife loves you. Everyone loves you. And when you get home at night, when you go home that night, you think you're a 15, but you're a 1. And you're going to be 0 soon. And when you get to 0, it's going to be a lot harder helping you than at 1.
Right.
He said, do you want any other advice? I said, no, that's it. You know what? That was it.
Right.
I stopped drinking and I went to AA meetings and I found them wherever I was. I mean, I found these things in Paris, you know.
Right.
It's always interesting when someone recognizes you and turns around and says your name in front of everyone. They're not supposed to do that, as you know.
Right.
Same woman did it to me in Palm Beach. I found a place in Palm Beach, sort of the Catholic church, sort of, community center. Walked in there and the same woman yelled out my name. It was good. But I don't care. I chair today something called the Partnership to End Addiction, which is a merger between CASA, which was the Center on Alcohol and Substance Abuse, and the Partnership for Drug-Free Kids. It's a merger of the two entities, and I chair that. I do talk to people whenever they want.
Right.
I haven't gone up to anyone yet and said, you need help, because I realize, and listening to everybody and go to so many meetings and listen to so many people speak, that's the one thing, not so great. If you want to be part of an intervention, which I've never done, that's one issue.
Right.
But I don't feel comfortable going up to someone and say, you really got a drinking problem. And look at me, I can help you. And it's not going to work.
Yeah.
But I have had people come to me and say, what do I do? Then I do. Then I help.
Yeah, sure. And have you found out in your very social life that people have responded positively? Can people tell the difference?
Oh, I don't think there's a soul that doesn't agree it was a good idea. I think when the truth be known, once you've been through this for a while, they'll say things like, it was a good call on your part to stop drinking.
Yeah.
I would have died. The amount of alcohol going in the system for so many years. You got to remember, I stopped when I was 65, and I started like everyone else when I was 15.
Yeah.
About starting when you're 15. What is interesting in AA meetings, nobody started at 65. Nobody. No. But and
there aren't a lot of people who stop at 65.
No. They just keep going
because there's I think it's so hard to imagine, especially at that point in your life, that there could be another way of doing this, and why would you try,
Exactly. But it's a very good point. But I realized that I had to do something. And I think once I got it resolved in myself to do something about it, I then could sort of really focus on that first step, which is if you don't have that one under your belt, you can't get to the second step.
Right, sure.
And I kept listening to that mantra, and that's the thing that basically got me through the beginning. And I had friends that would take me to meetings. But I must tell you that I've never seen anyone at 65. Look, I always said to myself as I got closer to 65, I am going to be just fine. I'm going to make it in this world and not have to go to AA, not have to go to rehab. I'm going to get there. I'll drink a little less and I'll be fine, Jack. Well, of course, can't drink a little less. If you could do that, you wouldn't be having this conversation. So that's the story. I was 65 years old, and now I'm now about to be 75 in a month, and I must tell you, it's been a totally changed life. You don't hang around the same people. I've also noticed that friends of mine, if they've gotten older, are drinking less.
Yeah. Me too.
A lot less.
Yeah, sure. That helps.
I mean, even some that have stopped not without having to go to AA, just
they just
drink it.
They can't handle it. Whatever, your body can't process it as well anymore.
I feel like shit the next day. I never really had a hangover because I always had a drink.
Would you have a drink in the morning?
Of course.
I mean, at your worst, how much would you say you were drinking?
Oh, I don't know. I would say it was never a question of a lot of hard liquor with me.
Right.
It was always wine.
Right.
So I remember I asked a friend of mine once whether he thought that 2 bottles of wine was a lot.
Right.
Drink. He said, in a day? I said, no, at lunch. And he looked at me like, are you crazy? I said, no, I'm asking a serious question. You think 2 bottles of wine at lunch is a lot? So I would say that was every chance of drinking 5 bottles a day was not a hardship. I mean, are you kidding me? You pour yourself a glass. The famous thing the English like to do, which is have a dressing drink.
Right. I mean, how civilized, right?
How perfectly British. You pour yourself a glass of vino, but it's like a third of the bottle.
Totally.
I didn't have little glasses hanging around the house.
I remember when I was working at William Morris, it was my first job, like one of basically my first job in Hollywood. And my boss came in, and I was his assistant, and he said, you don't look so good. And I said, yeah, I think I got the flu. And he's like, go home. If you don't feel well, go home. And I was like, all right, well, I'll see. Maybe I'll get better. I don't know. And, rolling calls, it's really busy. And then suddenly, like, it came to be lunchtime, and I was like, God, I'm kind of hungry. I guess I'm better. And then I was like trying to pace back in my head, like what I had done the night before. And like, I had sat at home and talked on the phone. And the last thing I remembered was like opening a bottle of scotch. And I mean, I had literally just like sat by myself talking on the phone and, plowed through a bottle of scotch without even really thinking about it, to the point where I was so hungover the next day, I couldn't, I could barely function, but it didn't I hadn't put 2 and 2 together that I was just hungover.
Well, you probably had alcoholic poisoning. That's the thing, that's what happens. I mean,
I definitely had that once or twice in my life that, I never went to see a doctor about it, but where you'd just be so brutalized by your behavior the night before.
Or falling down in public and things like that. I did that well, actually.
Well, I mean, and I could see how you could perform a pratfall in public and get away with it, like it's just sort of funny,
Yeah.
But
it didn't stop me drinking.
Yeah.
It didn't. Walking in and grabbing the shower curtain, having the whole thing come down on top of you, that didn't stop me drinking.
Right.
Just falling down in the lobby of the Plaza Atene Hotel, that didn't stop me drinking.
I mean, when your marriage fell apart and you said it was in part because of drinking, I mean, did you think to get help at that point or?
No. I didn't. I mean, you know what, looking back on it, I clearly should have. I mean, right. It would have been a good call, particularly because Fernanda's mother had died as an alcoholic.
Right.
That I hadn't. I didn't get help. I should have. I was very obstinate about I can handle this. I don't.
And was there a conversation at the time like you've got to like that's the issue? Like
no, it was an issue for a long time.
It was. I mean, that's the thing, is often it is the issue, but nobody can address it. I mean, all the other symptoms become the issue instead of the like.
Well, if you don't stop drinking, I'm going to leave you.
Right. Right.
But it had a long history of those conversations, if you know what I mean.
Right.
Nothing to do with her. It was completely my fault.
Have you guys had conversations about who you are now versus who you were?
No. She was terrific. One of these things that you have to do, you ask for forgiveness, or
amends.
I don't know how I could make it up to her. But anyway, she said, well, I forgave you a long time ago.
Right.
Don't worry. I forgave you a long time ago, and you're doing great. And thank God, and the girls love you, and it's terrific. She's been nothing but really supportive.
That's great. That's really cool. Well, Jamie, this has been great. Thanks for
Does this help at all? I don't know. It does.
I think it does. I think it's really. I mean, to me, it's it's interesting. Just the idea of like getting sober late in life. You don't hear about it a lot, and particularly the world that you grew up in, where there's so much stiff upper lipism. And you're expected to sort of white knuckle your way through every challenge that you're supposed to be man enough to handle your own problems. The idea of sitting in a room with a bunch of just like 4-time losers, and that is somehow going to make things better is not not the way we were raised. And
no, it wasn't.
I think it's
to deal with yourself, and everything had to be yourself. You had no one to talk to. My father was gone.
Right.
My mother was gone, obviously. So
right.
You know what? It's just the cards you get dealt, and you got to deal with them best you can. And then finally, you get lucky, and someone steps up and helps you, and then someone else helps you, and before you know it, you've got a bunch of people that are behind you 100% to go to meetings and to talk about it. And I'm not one of these people that wants to hide things from people, because that's not me. I don't care. I really don't. If I help one person stop drinking, then that's a fantastic day as far as I'm concerned. All right, bud, I gotta go.
All right, it's great talking to you. Thanks.
Be safe out there.
Hey, so if you've been enjoying this podcast, you can head over to my Patreon page and feel completely free to support the show with a modest contribution at www.patreon.com/thedrunkalogs. Drunkalogs cover art is designed and created by John DeManil, and the Drunkalogs theme song is composed and performed by Stephen Stout. I am Nick Morton.